All the action packed in 180 minutes. Power Breakfast with Tessa Dooms. Weekdays 6 to 9 a.m.
The time is 8:14. You're on Power Breakfast this morning with Tessa Dooms. Around the 14th of May, we had a conversation about 77 years of Israel, the nation state. And part of that conversation was with Tembisa Fakude, who shared his views on that history, the forming of Israel, etc. We are giving the right of reply to the South African Zionist Confederation or Federation this morning on that interview, and just setting up a conversation so that they can give their perspective on that history. What did Marx say? Religion is the opium of the masses, something that maybe is soothing people in a time of great crisis. And we'll remember that John Robbie raised this issue with us on Monday, where he said he's got this upset about the role that religion has played in societal dysfunction, and that sometimes that role has not actually been very constructive. And so I say this on the back of the conversation I started right at the beginning of the show, where I spoke about today being 77 years and marking 77 years since Israel became a state. And of course, I've always thought about the fact that naming Israel the nation state, Israel was a religious nod to people who would have the Christian background, the Jewish background, and be supportive of Israel of the Bible. But Israel of the Bible and Israel the nation state are not the same thing. Yet religion has been used often as a way to justify things that have happened in the last 77 years. And so we shouldn't have religion playing the role of justifying wrong, whether it's in Omotoso here in South Africa or whether it is in Netanyahu in Palestine and Israel. Surely we cannot have religion playing that kind of role in our society. And so I thought it would be good for us just to reflect, for people who don't always know that full history of the Israel conflict. Maybe it's time for us just to unpack that in a few moments here on the show. And so with us we have Tembisa Fakude. He's a senior research fellow for Africa-Asia Dialogues, who's written quite extensively on the Middle East. Tembisa, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And maybe we start at, what is the making of Israel in 1948? What does it look like? And how does it bring us to the moment we are now in?
Well, Israel was created post the Second World War, and there's been a lot of lobbying groups, including some of the gangsters, such as the Stain gang and others, who wanted to have their own country, and that country was supposed to be a theocracy. So it came quite handy after 1945, when the world was looking for a global peaceful resolution. So the creation of, for example, an apartheid South Africa was 1947-48. Yeah. A theocracy in Pakistan after the petitioning of the subcontinent of India was also 1947-1948. And they then felt that the Jews also deserve their own theocracies, and that's a theocracy, and that's why they created the State of Israel, or supported the State of Israel. Basically what the British did, they abandoned their mandate and led these gangsters from various parts of the world to establish a state in 1947-48, and that's how the State of Israel was created. And during that time, of course, thousands of Palestinians were displaced, killed, and many of them ended up in Gaza, and others in the West Bank and other neighboring countries.
And before we get into a deep dive on really how those displacements that you're talking about have happened over the years, the point that you make about theocracies being created, we have seen those evolutions, but it's good for us to remember that apartheid itself was a theocracy. That much about what the rationales for apartheid was based on the Bible. I remember living in Potchefstroom. There's a theology department there that was a big part of the university, and realizing that the Enige Kerk, was a big part of the machinery of the apartheid government and the socialization. So really important note that you've made there for us. But what happens with Israel from that point onwards? How do we get into a divisive conflict that has taken now decades to evolve to where we are?
Well, we have the Palestinians are forcefully removed from their homes, both in what is known as the West Bank, which is west of Jerusalem, and Gaza, and others who are currently in Lebanon and in Jordan and other neighboring countries, who then wanted to go back to their homes, and that's when the struggle started.
So with us this morning from the RealityCheck Research is the CEO, Daniel Pomerantz. Daniel, your response to those comments?
Well, thanks for having me on. I'll start by saying I absolutely agree with you that religion should not be the way that we make decisions about law or about how we build a nation. Indeed, Israelis agree. Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. That's the part you left out. It's the nation state of the Jewish people, not the Jewish religion. Many Jews are not religious at all. But the Jewish people have been prominent in modern archaeology, in the Christian and Jewish Bibles, and in the Quran. The Jewish people have lived in the land of Israel continuously for the past 3,500 years. For perspective, that's over 1,000 years before the religion of Islam even started or existed. Now, at times, Jews were forcibly exiled and always yearned to return, and at other times, Jews came back in large numbers, but there was never a time in 3,500 years when the Jewish people were not living in the indigenous Jewish homeland.
And I hear you there, Daniel, on that continuity, but you'd also agree that it's not only Jewish people who have occupied the territories that are in question here, and particularly those areas that Palestinian people have lived in as well for many, many years.
Indeed. And, Israel, like most modern Western nations, has a very strong emphasis on equal rights. Arabs and Palestinians who live in Israel are not only absolutely have full equal rights under the law, but many serve as members of parliament, doctors, lawyers, movie stars, professional athletes, police officers, Supreme Court justices, and even commanders in the IDF. In short, everything that humans in Israel do, Palestinians and Arabs do. Now, I want to be clear about something. I certainly wouldn't dream of lecturing a South African audience on what apartheid is. That's something that your audience knows better than anyone else. So instead, I'm just going to ask one thing, and I'd like to ask everyone in your audience who's listening right now. I'd ask you to look inside and ask yourself, especially those who are old enough to remember, search your memories, search your histories, or if you're too young, ask your grandparents. Is what I just described about Israel, doctors, lawyers, Supreme Court justices, is that what you remember apartheid as looking like?
And Daniel, the question there, though, is also about whether or not that's the experience of the majority of Palestinians in that region, because that also doesn't talk about the displacements that people have suffered, the fact that people have been moved from their homes, that there are people in Palestine right now who are saying that they are suffering those kinds of threats. And that's also part of the story, and that is where that comparison comes from.
Well, Mr. Fakude got a number of things wrong. Some of them are little things like saying the West Bank is west of Jerusalem. It's actually east. Some of them are larger things. So we should get this accurate. I'm sure he's visited. He says he's visited, but clearly he didn't remember too well. In 1948, when Israel became an independent nation again for the second time in history, there were two groups of Arabs. They hadn't started calling themselves Palestinians yet. That didn't come until 1964. At the time, Arab pan-nationalism was the main ethos. But those Arabs, there were two groups. One group decided to live peacefully with the Jewish people, and that group is still in Israel today. Those are the doctors and the lawyers and the actors and all the people who are still living there today. The other group decided to either flee or to take up arms. And when they took up arms, they massacred thousands of Jewish soldiers and civilians. This was a war. But in this war, a full 1% of the Jewish population was destroyed. Just for scale, 1% of South Africa is 640,000 people. That's enormous. So the people who had taken up arms against the new state of Israel ended up losing the ability to come back because they were a threat to the peace of the Jews and the Arabs who were living there peacefully together.
So, Daniel, just to go back to your question that you asked to us. In fact, there is a version of apartheid that sounds very much like what you're talking about Palestinians who take up positions of authority. It's called Bantustans. And Bantustans were places that were protected black spaces, but it was at the expense of the majority of black people. It was black people having the ability to own land and to govern, almost to have a quasi state of their own, but it was at the expense of deal making that came at the expense of the majority of people. To the second point that you're making, what you're saying is your recounting of history, because of course Mr. Fakude has his view, is that people were not displaced but ran away. And I think that is a disputed point. So I take that point and I put it to our listeners as well, but you have to acknowledge that that is a disputed point.
Well, I first of all encourage people to look everything that I'm speaking of. It's there are Wikipedia pages. There's plenty of information to confirm this, and there are many Arabs in Israel today who will speak about it. As to the version of apartheid that you're speaking of, it's not something I'm familiar with, and I'm not familiar with it because in Israel, what you're talking about simply does not exist.
I think that was the point of giving a right of reply so that both of those sides can be heard. But I do I'm grateful that we do agree on the question about not using religion in these kinds of conflicts. And the reason why I framed it that way, just for context, Daniel, is because as somebody who comes from a Christian community here, and I've observed, particularly in different parts of the world, evangelical Christians, a lot of that rhetoric has been there without the kind of context that you provided earlier on. But I think we appreciate that there are different versions or different readings of history here. And I think that the listener will make up their mind. They'll decide. But thank you so much, Daniel, for joining us in this conversation this morning. That is Daniel Pomerantz, who is the CEO of RealityCheck Research.